Hello, I'm Angela Clement, and I am a student at Athabasca University taking my Master's in Distance Education. Presently, I'm working on MDDE 621, which is Online Teaching in Distance Education and Training. So I've put together this presentation as part of an assignment and to give some information about multimedia instruction, specifically for online course designers. So the book that I've got this information from is Multimedia Learning by Richard Mayer. And the reason why I chose to do a presentation around the principles in this book is because I thought that these principles were very straightforward and very useful and practical for developing online courses. So what is multimedia? Mayer defines multimedia instruction as a presentation of material using both words and pictures with the intention of promoting learning. So the guiding thesis of this book is that people learn better from words and pictures than they do from just words alone. So this presentation will summarize the following questions that Mayer addresses in his book, which are: does adding graphics to words help people learn better? And what makes an effective graphic? And finally, how do people learn from words and pictures? It's important to note that when you and I are designing learning online, we want to take a learner-centered approach to teaching online rather than that technology approach. So what I mean is we want to make sure that we're not using the technology just because it's new and cool. The learner-centered approach begins with an understanding of how the human mind works, and then finding a technology that fits what we need to best help the learner process the information. So this presentation suggests Mayer's design principles using research behind how people learn better and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So here you see the principles that Mayer outlines in his book, and they are organized into 3 different categories. So the first category I've got in purple here is reducing extraneous processing. And those are for situations where students find the cognitive processing of extraneous material so demanding that there is little or no remaining cognitive capacity to engage in processing the information. So this could happen when the lesson contains some attention-grabbing extraneous material, so maybe some extra music or something, or when the lesson is designed in a confusing way. The second category is managing essential processing. And this category is a situation where the cognitive processing of the basic material in the lesson is so demanding again that there's little or no remaining cognitive capacity to engage in any deeper processing or understanding of the material. And this is likely to occur when the material is really complex, or maybe the learner is really inexperienced with that material, and if the presentation is really fast-paced. The final category in green is fostering generative processing. And in this category, it explains where the student has cognitive capacity available, but they just choose not to use it for making sense of the material. So in this case, the learners just fail to engage in the material at all. I plan to do a summary of each of these principles in my presentation so that you might be able to take the ideas and apply them to your own online courses as you are developing. These principles are all backed by interesting research that Mayer covers in his book. And if you are interested in digging further into that research, I highly recommend you do so by reading his book. His research examples are very clear, and they will give you a better idea of where these principles originated. So let's start with the first category, reducing extraneous processing. And the first principle here is around coherence. So in this principle, Mayer suggests that we delete any extraneous words, sounds, and pictures from a multimedia lesson, because too much extra material diverts the learner's attention from the important material of the lesson. I know I have always believed, and maybe you did too, that students learn better when they have an emotional interest in the material. And this is called the arousal theory. It seems common sense to us, but actually it's part of that old idea that learning takes place when the teacher gives the student information. We want to change our views instead on the idea that students construct knowledge or build mental representations based on what is presented and what they already know. The enjoyment for students actually comes from making sense out of a lesson. They enjoy lessons that they can understand. Adding music and sound effects or extra words or pictures might seem like the thing to do to make the lesson interesting. But in fact, research shows that students learn more when less is presented, because adding extraneous information gets in the way of their knowledge building process and limits their working memory. And also, Mayer warns that when extraneous information is highly noticeable or prominent in the lesson, the learners may organize the material in their mind around that extraneous information that you've added, rather than the intended important information of the lesson. We'll look at what might be done to motivate learners when we look at the principles for fostering generative processing towards the end of this presentation. The second principle in reducing extraneous processing category is signaling. So sometimes it's not possible to just delete the information from our lessons. Sometimes topics are very broad and you need to cover much information in order to help the learner understand the concept fully. So in this case, we want to insert cues that direct the learner's attention toward that essential material, which is a technique we call signaling. So I've been trying to use signaling for this presentation. Can you see where I have incorporated it into the lesson? We have all probably used some form of signaling in our lesson designs. Some examples of using signaling are using an outline sentence that lists the main steps, incorporating headings for each section, italicizing things, bolding things, highlighting or even repeating essential material. Sometimes we put emphasis on the important words when we're speaking. We might also signal the pictures or the graphics by using arrows, different colors, making them flash, or have pointing gestures. We might even gray out non-essential areas. Keep in mind that signaling does not add any new information. You might think that because you're not adding new information, that you're not affecting the student learning, and even that these signals might disrupt the learning because they are redundant. The knowledge construction view of learning holds that because the learner is trying to construct the knowledge from your lesson, your job is not just to present that material, but also to help guide the student in the way that they process that information. So by using signaling, we can guide what the learner pays attention to. So to help you understand the third principle on redundancy, listen carefully to this statement. Different people learn in different ways, so it is best to present information in many different formats. Would you agree with that? It may seem to make perfect sense that by using multiple presentation formats, you and I can accommodate each student's preferred learning style. This is called the learning preferences hypothesis, and it suggests that learners should be allowed to choose a method of instruction that best suits the way they learn, including being able to choose the format in which the information is presented. Again, according to Mayer, this thinking is based on traditional instruction, whereby the information is presented by you and I, the instructors, and then it is received by our students. The case against this thinking is the capacity limitation hypothesis, where it's believed that people have limited capacity to process visually presented material and limited capacity to process auditorially presented material. So when verbal information is presented by us visually and also orally, learners will be trying to process both in an attempt to understand both of them. The most efficient way to present verbal material is through spoken text only, so that the students can then use the visual channels for the pictures or the graphics. When we are making a multimedia presentation that consists of narrated animation, Mayer suggests that we do not add on-screen text that duplicates the words that are already in the narration. Research suggests that it's harmful to present printed and spoken text together when there are pictures involved. As well, however, this is not to say that we should never present printed and spoken text together. There are what they call boundary conditions for this principle, which suggests that the redundancy principle might be a little less applicable when the captions are shortened to just a few words and placed next to the part of the graphic that they describe. Or you could take the spoken text and present it before the printed text rather than at the same time. And if there are no graphics and the verbal segments are short, then that would put less pressure on the student to process that information. So in each of these cases, we can lessen the extra processing for the learner, but in effect, it is a good idea to think about when you are presenting something in that visual channel through pictures and text that you may be providing some cognitive overload for your students. As online educators and course designers, we do have to think about how to best present our material on a page. And so the spatial contiguity principle can help us with that. So tell me, if you had a passage on lightning formation that contained 600 words and 5 pictures, and you had to present this information on 2 pages, what would you do? You could put all the words on one page and all the pictures on the other. And we call this a separation design because you place the graphics in a different place than the text. You might also place each picture next to the paragraph that describes it. Or you could copy some of the keywords from the paragraph as a caption for that corresponding picture. And we would call these integration designs. So which would work best for fostering learning in your students? We might think that when you separate the words and the pictures, that the learner would first study the words that describe the steps, and then study the pictures. And because we have exposed them to the same material twice, that should result in the students learning more than just presenting it once. Mayer objects to this idea because, again, it is that idea that learning just involves adding the information to memory. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning would suggest that the learner must make sense of the material. So integrating the words and the pictures encourages the learner to build connections between the two. In the separated version, the learner must search the screen or the page to try to find a graphic that corresponds with that printed sentence. And this process requires cognitive effort that could have instead been used to support the process of active learning. Placing the necessary information along with the text provides the learner guidance on how to mentally process it. Should we present words and then pictures, or words and pictures at the same time? This is where the temporal contiguity principle might help us. It might seem obvious to choose to show words and pictures one following the other, so that learners see the information twice. What we learned from the spatial contiguity principle is that repeating information only helps students commit that information to memory. The temporal contiguity principle suggests that our students are more likely to understand multimedia presentations when corresponding words and pictures are available in working memory at the same time. Narration can be processed in the verbal channel, while the corresponding graphic is processed in the visual channel. The spatial contiguity principle and the temporal contiguity principle complement each other. They both give the benefit of some guidance for the learner around how to process the information. Research shows that we should present pictures and text simultaneously in our designs. Sometimes this principle might not apply as strongly if the successive verbal and picture segments are really short rather than long, or if the lesson is learner-paced rather than system-based. Mayer cautions, we must not apply these laws to all situations, but we can apply these in ways that are consistent with what we know about how people process words and pictures in their cognitive systems. So in the second category, which is managing essential processing, we have three principles, and the first one is segmenting. So in this principle, if a lesson is fast-paced, a learner may not have enough capacity to mentally organize the words into a verbal model and mentally organize the pictures into a pictorial model. So when lessons are too complex and too fast and new to the learner, we should try to segment these lessons to avoid cognitive load. We can do this in a couple of ways. We can break a lesson into parts, and we want to make those segments clear to the learner because the learner may not necessarily know that they need to stop in order to give themselves time to process that information, and they may use extraneous processing to determine how to break the lesson into segments. So we want to make that clear for them so that they don't have to do that. The other thing we can do is give the learner some control of the pacing from one segment of the lesson to the next. Mayer suggests we can do this by using the slider bars, or the next button, or the pause button. We just have to watch out that we don't give the learner too much control where they have to decide when to use that slider bar or the pause button, because that too can cause extraneous processing. So what Mayer suggests is that the designer set up the program so that it automatically stops at the end of each segment and then allows the learner to continue when they're ready. Of course, if the lesson is not too fast-paced and the content is simple and the learner has experience with the material, that segmenting may not be necessary, but it's something to consider when your lessons are a little more involved and they're going to need more cognitive processing. Pre-training is the second principle in the category of managing essential processing. And in this principle, we have to understand that sometimes the pace of our lessons do not allow for students to be able to figure out the concepts and the vocabulary that they need to know before they have to understand the lesson. So Mayer tells us when the learner already knows the name and characteristics of each part, the learner can engage in cognitive processes for building a causal model of the system, leading to better understanding. According to Mayer, prior knowledge is the single most important individual difference dimension in instructional design. So in other words, we want to know a learner's prior knowledge, and that way we can present the concepts that students need to know before the lesson to help our students become more successful. And they call this pre-training. So an example might be having a diagram showing the components of a braking system that students might interact with before they learn how the braking system works. We should not take this as a message that we should always begin a lesson with key terms and definitions, and I think that sometimes, teachers just automatically do that first. Mayer says students who already know the key terms are not likely to be helped by pre-training. And in some cases, they may find that pre-training detracts from their learning. Other students, of course, will need to know the meanings of words and symbols so that they can use their cognitive capacity to learn. And so I know some teachers have set up little pre-courses or, some kind of initial test just to see what students already know before they actually engage in the lesson. And there may be a short instruction on the vocabulary that the students need to know for those ones that don't have that knowledge yet. The final principle in this category is modality. And the modality principle you'll find is very similar to the redundancy principle. The redundancy principle tells us that people learn better from graphics and narration than from graphics, narration, and text together. And if you remember, we learned that it can happen particularly when the material is difficult, the presentation of the material is too fast for the learner, and if the learners are unfamiliar with that vocabulary. And the reasoning again is that if you include both text and graphics, they both have to process through that visual channel, and they may overload cognitive processing. The modality principle is similar in that it's saying that we should put pictures with spoken words rather than with printed words. And the reason behind it is the same. Pictures and written words must both be processed through the visual channel, and when you do that, it in fact leaves the auditory channel underused. So Mayer tells us the idea is that meaningful learning occurs when a learner selects, organizes, and integrates that knowledge in each of those auditory and visual channels. The modality principle may not apply when learners experience difficulty in identifying which part of the graphic the words are talking about. So there was some research done by Jang, Chandler, and Sweller, and they're cited in Mayer. And what happened in their research is they found out that spoken text was more effective than printed text when the corresponding part of the graphic was highlighted. So they had it flashing, but it was not when it was not highlighted. So Mayer points out that printed text lasts longer than spoken words. And so in that case, the learner has more time to process that information. So he suggests that, sometimes you may want to use text. You should place it next to that graphic, which is that spatial contiguity principle. And he also says that printed words might also be appropriate when the learners are non-native speakers, so their English is a second language, or maybe they're hearing impaired, or when the lesson includes, a lot of technical words and symbols. Okay, so the final and third category is fostering generative processing, and you'll notice that it has two principles in it, the first one being multimedia. So this one asks the question, why should we even bother to deliver information in duplicate ways? Isn't that a little redundant? If information is already delivered using words, isn't it kind of useless to deliver the same information again in pictures? According to Mayer, our job is not just to present the material to our students, but we must also help guide the learner's cognitive processing of that presented material. The same information might be put into pictures or words, but these are actually not equal. One cannot be substituted for another. So having both the picture and the words together allows the learners to hold corresponding verbal and pictorial representations in working memory at the same time. And this increases the chances that learners will be able to build mental connections between those. And we know that building these connections are an important step in understanding. Mayer's research and others have showed that students who learned with words and pictures were actually able to provide more creative answers and learn the meanings of the new words much better. Mayer warns us that in textbooks, he has seen an overwhelming majority of illustrations that served no important instructional purpose. And I challenge you to have a look at some of those textbooks and look at the pictures, or maybe even your own lessons, and think about, what instructional purpose do those pictures actually have there? He also gives some advice about using graphic advance organizers with a combination of graphics and text. He says that those can help learners to understand the text when they're presented before a text passage. The multimedia principle may apply more strongly to low knowledge learners than to high knowledge learners. And we presume this is because low knowledge learners need guidance in building the connections between pictorial and verbal representations, where high knowledge learners probably are doing that innately. So our final principle is personalization, voice, and image. Multimedia learning, according to Mayer, can be viewed as a conversation between the learner and the instructor. We want to make our online presentations personal so that our students can relate to us just as they would in a face-to-face conversation. Personalization involves taking the words in a multimedia lesson and converting them from a formal style to a conversational style. The content of the course will remain the same, but we will add our own personal touch to the lesson. Why? Social cues such as personalization may encourage learners to try harder to understand a multimedia lesson. We want to personalize it in a natural way so that it's not distracting to the learner. So how do we personalize our lessons so that learners will engage and try harder? First of all, we need to be polite so that our learners feel appreciated and respected. We want to use a conversational style rather than a formal style. We can do this by using the words you and I rather than using third-person constructions. We also want to speak with a friendly voice. It makes sense that research shows that students will favor a friendly voice over a machine-created voice. They can relate to a person's voice who sounds like they are like themselves. You might be wondering if it might help even more if you include an image of yourself. Mayer tells us that there is evidence to show that a conversational style helps students learn better. but there is little evidence to suggest that an image of the instructor helps the learner, unless, perhaps, if they are pointing to a relevant portion of a graphic. So now we have covered all of the design principles as expressed by Richard Mayer in his book Multimedia Learning. These instructional design principles can be used not only in multimedia situations, but also in a book-based environment as well. Certain factors such as adding pictures to words, placing text close to the corresponding graphic, and eliminating extraneous material can be applied to instructional messages to make them more effective. As instructors, we must always keep in mind that we are not there just to deliver information. It is our job to ask ourselves, which instructional techniques help guide the learner's cognitive processing of the presented material? Essentially, we must ask ourselves, how do people learn better?